Hello, friends. Welcome to episode 54 of the Alabama Liberal Podcast. Today we're going to be talking about centrist versus socialist versus social justice warriors equals Joe Biden, invisible frontrunner. Now, you may think, well, that's a weird equation. Versus equals. How do you get that kind of math? Just pretend it's a liberal equation. It's abstract. Think of it like the freedom dividend or trickle-down economics. Doesn't have to make sense. What you may really be thinking about is, in episode 53, you might have noticed that Michael did not co-host that one. Out of all the 52 episodes we had, he co-hosted all of them, and he wasn't in that one. And you may think, what's going on? What's happening? Well, I have great news for people who like bad news, because he's not going to be in this one either. And the only reason for that is because I simply cannot find him. When I set out to do this podcast, I wanted to break records. I wanted to be the most listened to podcast in Alabama. I wanted to bring in red state liberals. If you could break iTunes downloads, that would be great. I didn't think I would be the Guinness Book of World Records first podcast host to be ghosted by his co-host. Part of me wanted to maybe rebrand this podcast, do a true crime podcast like Where is Michael, make it into a missing persons case, because that would probably be 10 times more popular than politics, everybody's least favorite subject. So if I did a true crime podcast, I'd probably get a lot more listeners, and maybe we'll hunt around and see if we can find him in a few episodes or something. But there was the first 50 episodes, and then episode 51, which was like November 2017, and then episode 52, which was summer of 2019. And then in 52, I said we're going to do a series of reunion podcast episodes, which I had kind of been pushing for that for a while. You heard me say it on the episode, and you may have wondered, well, how come there was no episodes at all the rest of 2019? And I couldn't find them to record them. Unfortunately, I don't have subpoena power. I can't subpoena someone and make them co-host a podcast that they have no interest in. And that's unfortunate, because we had great chemistry. It was very easy. He's an easy person to talk to, and we had a very good thing going, I think. You don't want to force someone, and you kind of think recording a podcast is something that's supposed to be fun. It's something people are supposed to enjoy doing, or you hope that they enjoy doing it. You don't want it to feel like a chore. And so episode 51 is a year and a half after you finish, and then episode 52 is 2 years after that, and then episode 53 has to be 6 months later. If you're trying to do a podcast with any kind of consistency, it's really hard to grow an audience when it's like, hey, the next episode's going to be between 2 weeks to 8 months from now. Look for that whenever you can. It's really sporadic, hard to get people excited about that, especially in 2020 when you got a presidential race, and it's the perfect time for a second season. So I had to face a dilemma. I was like, look, you can either not do the podcast at all and just let it die, but you've still got Alabama Liberal and this brand that you've invested a lot of time and energy and may never pay off, but you've put about 10 years of your life into this, and then you just got a website sitting there with no podcast when people are dying for political content, especially when it's somewhat popular, what you're doing in the first place. So you can either stop it altogether and kill it, or you can do what the Simpsons have done, which is move forward with no guarantee of quality. Like you can sit there and think, well, if I move forward without him, it won't be the same. It may not be as good. The quality may not be there, but I guess the Simpsons, it never stopped them, and they're still going 30 seasons in. They ran out of stories years ago, and it does seem to make any difference. And so that was sort of the dilemma I was faced with. Obviously, I'm Alabama Liberal, so I'm not going to err on the side of quality, but then you think, if you're going to continue it, should you try to get a new co-host, which would be possibly a disaster. The only people I know that I interact with on a day-to-day basis is my 6-year-old son and my infant daughter. They'd have a fresh take on Trump. My son, he just says Trump sucks, and that's all he ever says. My daughter, she could drill on the phone or something like that. I don't know. So they may be able to add a fresh take, but not necessarily a superior one. So even if you can find somebody, then you got to think, is it really, it's weird. It's like the Cousin Oliver, like back in the old sitcoms when an actor they didn't want to continue and they would get out of their contract, they'd want to be paid more money, and then they don't continue, and then they get a replacement in there. And the Simpsons again had a hilarious episode about Poochie, the dog that sucked, but they brought him back. So you think it won't be the same, it may not be right, but if you go forward by yourself, that may be the worst of all possible worlds, because for a podcast, when you have a co-host, you can bounce ideas off, you can talk to somebody, you don't look insane. When you're talking to yourself for an hour, there's a thin line between a podcast and a psychosis at that point. I mean, it's psychopathy at a certain point. I'm holed up in the bunker, I'm like, here's why Trump is the new antichrist I'm drawing equations on the board. I'm like Carrie from Homeland with her court board, drawing the strings. Here's how Mitch McConnell's connected to Putin, which actually is what's happening right now. So much of what we're dealing with in 2020 is a president put in power by a hostile foreign government and Mitch McConnell calling Moscow Mitch. So there's so many conspiracy theories just talking about politics. A man talking about that by himself, he really runs the risk of looking like a nutter. Michael was great because he was sort of the guardrails a little bit. Like when you go bowling, and maybe I'm not a good bowler, but I roll gutter balls over and over and over. He was the bumpers. He sort of kept the ball between going in the gutter lanes, and if I ever got too far down my own rabbit hole, he would pull it back. And now that he's not doing it anymore, or at least not for the next few episodes as far as I know, it's going to be kind of dangerous. I mean, basically I could go way down the rabbit hole. I mean, you might hear me on episode 55 being like, and here's how I know that Trump is the second coming of the Antichrist, and that's connected to how we faked the moon landing, and Lee Harvey Oswald, of course. I mean, I could get really deep into some shit that makes no sense. I was kind of the better at in the many different issues and going deep into that and doing a deep dive, and he was almost like, let's pull it back, let's make it a little bit more accessible. And I think that was really worked. That kind of thing worked. You almost need that before you go too deep into your own rabbit hole. So I don't know if he'll be back for further episodes down the road. I sure hope he is. I really do. I hope he comes back soon. But in the meantime, I want to talk about what's going on because it's important and it's exciting. So we have a political race right now that the Democratic primary is fire hot. You have 4 candidates who realistically have a chance at winning this thing. Pete Buttigieg, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, and Joe Biden. And it's interesting because there's all these divisions in the Democratic Party, and they keep shifting around. I mean, it's like a 3-card Monte where every week you don't know who the popular candidate to hate is, who the popular candidate to love is, because it shifts constantly. In the beginning of this race, the Bernie and the Warren people, it seems like a long time ago, but this is only about 6 months ago, the Bernie and the Warren people, they were rock solid. They pretty much liked each other. They got along pretty well. I didn't hear a lot of grumbling about Elizabeth Warren. And then if you remember back in our 2016 episodes, we talked about many times that it seemed like an element of the Bernie bros was definitely sexist. You saw it all over his campaign, the sexual harassment cases, the fact that he kind of downplayed them. He didn't really want to investigate them. All the Bernie bros bullying Hillary people online. Some of the campaign offices felt like a frat house. All of the Bernie people, they'd say, it's not about we don't want a woman president. We don't want a woman president. Do you want Hillary Clinton to be president? Hell no. Hell no. Hell no. Do you like Nancy Pelosi? No, we don't. We sure don't. Do you like Kamala Harris? Fuck her. We don't like her. And Debbie Wasserman Schultz was a favorite target of theirs. So then you say, okay, so who's the one woman that you would ever consider voting for president? Elizabeth Warren. And they would routinely say that. Be like, we're not sexist. We like Elizabeth Warren, and do we mention Elizabeth Warren? Now, Elizabeth Warren is in the race, and only a week ago I was seeing Never Warren trending on Twitter. This was majority from Bernie people. So there does seem to be an animosity between the Bernie people and the Warren people, and that's not totally surprising because a lot of the Warren fans are former Hillary fans. So a lot of Hillary people, of course, don't like Bernie from 2016. They feel like he cost her the race. They feel like he fucked it up for her. And now a lot of those people have kind of gone with Elizabeth Warren. So there's no surprise that a big chunk of her fan base doesn't like him that much. And a big chunk of his fan base doesn't like anybody who seems like they're fucking it up for Bernie. And they believe if she dropped out of the race, he'd be the nominee. They're looking at the polls and they're saying, hey, a lot of her fans, about half her fans are Hillary Clintonites and about half her fans are progressives who want to see real and genuine change. A lot of her fans may come over to Bernie if she drops out of the race. They feel kind of a false narrative, which is that Bernie and Warren are splitting the progressive vote. If either one of them dropped out, the other could win and beat Joe Biden. But as is, they're splitting too many votes and neither one of them can get ahead of him. It's not totally the truth. When you get into who the fan bases are for each one of these candidates, it's a lot more complicated than that. They showed that Bernie's fans are typically more male, Warren's fans are typically more female, Warren's fans are typically more college educated, policy wonk, a little bit wealthier than Bernie fans. Bernie fans are typically a little bit younger. I mean, it really does seem like the former Hillary fans went with Warren. Bernie has kept almost his identical base from 2016. And a lot of the Obama coalition, some of them went with Hillary in 2016. That's how she was able to get twice the number of votes that Bernie did and all this stuff. A lot of them have gone with Biden. So Biden's picking up a lot of the old Obama coalition that don't really like Elizabeth Warren that much and don't feel like she's the natural successor to Hillary. So he's got that and the older African-American vote and what are sometimes called the Reagan Democrats. A lot of the rural people, the hard knock people. But it's very strange to watch this race unfold because Joe Biden is ahead in every poll, barely winning in Iowa. He may not win Iowa, but right now he's got a small statistical lead in Iowa. But Iowa's interesting because it could go to Buttigieg, Warren, Sanders, or Biden. It could go to any of the top 4. But he's got a small lead there. He's got an enormous lead in South Carolina, pretty big lead in Nevada. South Carolina is the real indicator typically of who's going to be the Democratic nominee. They typically predict that pretty well. You have to look at that and think Joe Biden is ahead in every national poll. Every national poll, he's got double-digit lead over Bernie Sanders, which is usually who comes in second. And yet the media talks about it. Is it going to be Warren? Is it going to be Bernie? Is it going to be Buttigieg? It almost looks like Joe Biden is not running in this race. And you look at all these endorsements are going to Warren. The New York Times endorsed Klobuchar. Some of you may have seen this, or you may have at least heard people talk about it. There's a show called The Weekly that comes on FX, which is like a 60 Minutes or a Vice that HBO used to do, but it's on FX. And it's the New York Times. They do about half hour to an hour segment on some story that they're working on. Some of these episodes are really good. They had one about rare diseases and orphan drugs and how orphan drugs can bankrupt people for their health care. So some of these episodes are really good. But the one that most people have heard of and the one that's the most heavily criticized is they had the New York Times editorial board. They brought in all the Democratic presidential candidates and they interviewed them to decide like who they're going to endorse for the presidency. So they bring in Andrew Yang, who looks like he's not even taking this shit serious. He's just like party boy, like, hey, he looks like he's totally feeling himself. I don't know where he got this confidence from. They bring in Klobuchar and Warren, and that's who eventually gets their endorsement. But they narrow it down to the top four, which is Buttigieg, Cory Booker. That's hilarious. It's only about 2 weeks that they filmed this that Cory Booker drops out of the race. Even at the time they're doing this, it is obvious he is not going to be the nominee. Kamala Harris has already dropped out. There's nowhere for Cory Booker to go. It is obvious he's not going to be the nominee. Their top four was Buttigieg, Booker, Klobuchar, and Warren, and they eventually picked Klobuchar and Warren. The only people who seemingly don't make it into the top four are Biden and Sanders, the two people most likely to win the nomination. It really reminds me of 2016, where Trump was ahead in every fucking poll. He was dominating press coverage. He was ahead in every poll. All the pundits who have been so consistently wrong about everything, they all thought he'll run out of steam, he'll collapse, he'll break down. They're sitting there being like, is it going to be Jeb Bush or Rubio? And that was the race in their minds that was gearing up, even though Trump and Ted Cruz was the actual race. And it's similar to that right now, where every time you get on Twitter and the New York Times and all these different sites, is it going to be Warren or Buttigieg? They're duking it out. And Biden and Sanders are at the top of every polls, but because they're older, their base is maybe not telegenic, let's put it that way, out front base that you can find. They're not beloved by the media in that way. It's almost like they're being ignored for candidates that are almost certainly not going to be the nominee. And that definitely reminds me of Trump. I mean, Lindsey Graham would be like, I endorse Jeb Bush. He's a great candidate. Jeb Bush drops out of the race. I like Rubio. Rubio's my new pick. I'm going to vote for him. Rubio drops out of the race. Okay, I'll choose Ted Cruz over Trump if I must. Ted Cruz, he just dropped out. Now Trump's got the nomination. That's what it feels like. They're going to go through every single candidate while Biden collects more and more states and eventually becomes the nominee. And part of that is division and the fractions that are happening within the base. You have the Socialists, which is most prominently Bernie Sanders. It's kind of interesting that so far his most high-profile political nominations are all the squad. And the squad are people that he mostly put in office in the first place. So I think only Maya Presley, one is with Elizabeth Warren, the other three went with him. And these are the people he put in office in the first place. So it's sort of like between 2016 and 2020, rather than trying to win over some of the more establishment Democrats, he's almost been like, fuck them. These people will never like me. The best thing I can do is get them out of office. So let's get rid of the Joe Crowleys and replace them with the AOCs and the people that they'll endorse me later on. He tried to do that with the DNC chairship. He wanted Tom Perez out of the way so that he can put Keith Ellison in. People like me said at the time, and were right, that Keith Ellison is a horrible, horrible pick to lead the DNC because we knew the skeletons in his closet. Even in Minneapolis, I lived there. I lived in Minneapolis before Los Angeles. I knew a black woman who was like, yeah, there's not a hot black woman in Minneapolis that Keith Ellison hasn't made a move on. Everywhere you go, you'd hear stories about he'd be at a party, he'd grab somebody's ass. I mean, it wasn't a shot that he's been Me Too'd between now and then. And I'm not saying white Minnesotans, because they didn't seem to know any fucking thing about this, but a lot of people who maybe had at least talked to some black women who live in that city, they knew of it and they were familiar with it. Even at the time, he has a bad reputation. He's the worst possible person to lead because he's going to get in there and then 6 months later there'll be a scandal and then they'll be able to sink him and make it all about him while the Democrats are trying to regain in the House in the midterms. Instead, the DNC wisely picks Tom Perez, who is the definition of boring. The same reason a lot of Twitter doesn't like a lot of these people like Joe Biden, especially Tom Perez, is because they're boring. They're not very interesting. But that's sort of what you need while you try to rebuild a political party that's fighting at a disadvantage. In Twitter, people only know people that are like them. They only know people that everybody supports Bernie. Everybody likes him. No, they don't. I mean, a substantial chunk of the country does not like him, cannot stand him. And I mean, other Democrats don't like him. But in their mind, everybody likes him because because that's who they're talking to on Facebook and Twitter and maybe in their real life. Like, this is the community. This is where that you go to a Facebook page that say progressives are us or whatever it is, and then you look at the comments and they're all overwhelmingly, they're like, everybody likes this guy. Or they could make something trend. They may never warrant trend thousands of tweets in a single hour. But you got to keep in mind, America is a country of 330 million people. Even the most fringe lunatic beliefs can get 1 million people to support it, and if those people get on social media, which they almost all of them are, it can make something look a lot more popular than it really is. There's probably 1 million people in the United States that are flat earthers. I bet there's at least several 100,000 flat earthers in the United States of America. So you're talking about the most lunatic of fringe beliefs, probably less than 0.5% of people, but that's still hundreds of thousands. And so it looks like, hey, more and more people are believing in flat earth, man. I think we're getting more and more people. They even have conventions and go to them. So you've got the socialists that are backing Bernie Sanders, and some of them backing Elizabeth Warren, or they used to. They used to like her, and now I think some of them are turning on her. Then you have the social justice warriors. They're the most disappointed in this crop because Kamala Harris was sort of trying to be their champion and trying to lead them. I picked to win the whole thing, who I wanted to be the nominee, but they never got behind her. The whole time it was like, Kamala's a cop. You used to see that trend everywhere like that. I don't even know who started that shit. I think it was mostly, to be honest with you, black men that didn't like that she married a white guy. She was never as popular as you'd think she would be with black men. Gee, I wonder why. I think it's because she married a white guy. Pretty fucking positive it is. You have to almost be in an interracial couple to know that world, the inside dynamics of it, and know why they care. And there was too many things I was seeing that I've heard in my own personal life throughout the years, and especially online and even in person. When you're a white guy married to a black woman, you're on the subway and they'll come up and be like, what are you doing, sister? Like, they think nothing of bothering strangers on the street. It doesn't happen every day. It doesn't happen every week, but it's happened enough. I'm going to say throughout the course of my whole dating life since I was a teenager, it's probably happened 100 times. And when you used to get on Facebook groups, like women that like white men or interracial couples forever, whatever it would be, there would be this enormous pushback, majority of it from black men, that would just have a huge problem with this. And that seemed to be a lot of the same people that are like, I don't trust Kamala Harris. I don't trust Kamala Harris. I don't like Kamala Harris. And you'd say, well, what don't you like about her? She's a prosecutor, and when she was a prosecutor, get this, she prosecuted people. I rest my case. Mic drop. Yes, she was a prosecutor, and part of your job is to put people that break the law in jail. This isn't a mystery. But was she a progressive prosecutor? I think she was. I think the people of San Francisco were way better off having her prosecute their cases. There was a cop killer, and she refused to seek the death penalty for him. Dianne Feinstein got mad. Dianne Feinstein and Barbara Boxer and Nancy Pelosi and that whole white female establishment never really liked Kamala, and I don't even think it was that personal. I think it was just, this is somebody we haven't handpicked to come up behind us and eat our breadcrumbs. And if you're a black woman, we want you to work as our chief of staff, maybe our press secretary, maybe, but how dare you come up the DA for San Francisco, or eventually the attorney general, or eventually get my Senate seat. And so these are a white female establishment in California, very powerful, that's never really liked her that much. So she kind of got it from both sides. There was a lot of white women that never fully got behind her. If Kamala Harris was the exact same person but white, every Elizabeth Warren fan and Hillary fan and all these people would have been like, oh, she's the best candidate that we could ever hope for. She's 10 times better than anybody else. They were very cool towards her. A lot of the social justice warriors never got behind her. They never embraced her. They would say things like she was against marijuana legalization before she was for it, as was Barack Obama, as was Hillary Clinton, as was just about every candidate running it. They just had this big suspicion of her. They were suspicious of a Howard graduate who was an AKA and had to move her way up the ranks of the lily white California political establishment. At the time that she becomes a California AG, so there's not a single statewide black politician. She becomes the only one at the time. Then she becomes the first black female senator from California ever, and only like the second black female senator in history. The amount of things you have to do to become that, yes, you may have to make a few compromises, and you may have to do a few things that you don't want to do, but you are eventually going to get to a point where if she had been president, you can't tell me she wouldn't have been more civil rights oriented than Joe fucking Biden or Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders thinks that class is what's driving America. He's kind of blind towards racial issues because he thinks class is what does it. If people have more money, then their racism will magically disappear. It's never been the case, probably never will be, but that's what he believes. A little bit of what Andrew Yang believes. It was kind of funny to me that because Cory Booker and Kamala Harris either had to drop out or were getting nowhere, people were like, Andrew Yang's our last minority candidate on the debate stage. If your sole non-white hope is Andrew Yang, you're in some deep shit, because he did not really want that label, that that mantle. I mean, he cracks more Asian jokes than Joe Biden does. Like, it was a parody of itself that the social justice warriors were that desperate for a non-white face that they went with Andrew Yang, who also believes a little bit about what Bernie does, that class trumps race, which I don't necessarily think is true. Andrew Yang said, if you look at the news, you would think Trump became president due to a factor of Russia, racism, and Hillary's emails. Well, yeah, because that's pretty much how he did it and became president. White resentment, fears, anxieties, and Russia meddling with it. With Kamala, though, you had a lot of people being like, oh, we don't like Kamala Harris, she's a cop, we don't trust her, we don't like her. Then the second she drops out of the race, same fucking people, primary so white, black woman can't catch a break, same people that never liked her, the HBCU graduates that you'd think would be her natural constituency since she went to Howard, were coming out there being like, what lily white Democrats, they never would support this woman. And you could go back 2 weeks ago and find them sending out tweets being like, I don't like Kamala, she's fake, she's bullshit, I don't like her. It was really weird to have these people turn on a dime and then all of a sudden be Kamala Harris fans. And they're still not Kamala Harris fans. If Joe Biden picks her to be vice president, which I think he should, but if he picks her, they're going to be like, another boring establishment pick. Or they still don't really like her, if we're being honest. Then you have Cory Booker, whose candidacy never got off the ground for multiple different reasons. He never had the cash, even though he's very business friendly. Cory Booker is like, if you want a fatter, balder, less charismatic, more corporate friendly version of Barack Obama, you've already got Deval Patrick. So when Deval Patrick jumped in the race at the last minute, Deval Patrick's in a weird place because it's like he's in the race, but he's not really in it. He joined too late. But if he joins the race and then has to withdraw a month later, it's almost humiliating. So he's there. He knows he's not going to win. He knows he's not even a factor. He's never been in a single debate. Unlike Bloomberg, I haven't seen a single TV ad for him. It's now a week before the Iowa. He knows he can't win. There's no way. But he jumped in so late that if he jumps out right now, it is almost humiliating to enter and then leave 2 weeks later. You're at a party where you know you don't belong, but you just got there and everybody's watching you, and it's almost like, I don't want to be real suspicious by leaving real quick, but I'm pretty sure if he left, I don't even know if people would know the difference. Like, I don't even know if they would know or care. People that wanted the mantle of social justice warrior like Cory Booker, they've all suspended their campaigns, they're dropped out. So there's no real place for these people to go except for the four main candidates. And they don't like Pete Buttigieg, even though you think they might because he would be the first gay president, but that's not seen as a very exciting. Something about that isn't translating well with these people. They think that he's too boring, basically. You know, he says he's the first gay president, but maybe he's really secretly heterosexual because he's not flamboyant enough. He's not their idea of what you would necessarily think. It's very easy to watch Buttigieg for hours give speeches in town halls and debates and then totally forget that he's gay. And I don't know, there's something about that they're not necessarily in sync with the performative wokeness of the LGBTQ community. Like, they want to turn in the debates and let it be queer eye for the straight guy. I mean, they want something that's a little bit more obvious. And I don't know what Buttigieg could do besides come out and drag maybe, but there's just something about him that they're not responding to. And part of it is that he's a 0% in the polls with black voters. But that really his fault? Or is it that maybe they don't want a gay candidate? I mean, it's been very strange to watch that be the dig against him over and over again, to be like, hey, you're polling very low with black voters. What's behind that? He can't say it's because of homophobia, even though in the Democratic Party, black churches were very against gay marriage, where almost no other group in the Democratic Party cared and or were very supportive of it. So he can't say it's because of homophobia, even though he probably knows that it is. They've probably done their internal polling and have come up with that. But to be like, you can't get anywhere in this race because you're at 0% with black voters, almost like that's his fault or there's something he's doing. So he's in a weird place, because if he were just a straight heterosexual, if he had a wife named Kelly that was blonde and he was out on the campaign trail, he probably would have fared about as well as Tim Ryan and Seth Moulton and O'Rourke and Steve Bullock. And a lot of these guys are better candidates than Buttigieg just in terms of their experience level and things like that. But they couldn't get anywhere. They didn't want a heterosexual white guy unless it was Joe Biden. That was all they were interested in, and they wouldn't take it in any other variety or any other flavor. And he just couldn't get anywhere. And he couldn't self-fund like Bloomberg and Steyer, and he didn't have the huge base of support that Bernie Sanders did and all the donors that he had. So it's almost weird. If he had been a heterosexual white guy, he probably wouldn't have done as well as he has, but him being gay is holding him back back in so many constituencies that the Democrats rely on, like black voters, and that's why he probably can't become the nominee. Perfect on paper. He speaks all these languages. He's very intelligent. He's the most Obama-like of all the candidates. It's been funny to me to watch Obama really not care for him that much. They say secretly Obama doesn't like any of the candidates that much, and that includes his own Vice President Joe Biden. But it's been odd to me that Obama has not more fully embraced Buttigieg, considering that they're actually quite similar. They both have the soaring rhetoric. They're both younger. They both see the world in a different way than some of the older, more established candidates. He can look at the problems we actually face and the future that we actually face. It would surprise me if he were the nominee. At this point, I think he faces an uphill battle, but I still don't think it's as tough as Elizabeth Warren. I think her candidacy's dead, and that's not popular. People don't want to hear that. She come out as a progressive, and so as a progressive, she's right where Bernie Sanders is on every single issue, but at the same time, she's more palatable to business interests. That's not a very satisfying track to take inside the Democratic Party, to be like, I'm left of Kamala Harris, but I'm a slightly to the right of Bernie Sanders. All the business interests are still going to hate you. They're still going to look at you and be like, we don't trust you, you're crazy. We didn't want you to be the Treasury Secretary under Hillary Clinton. That gave us heartburn. Just something like that, right? So they look at her like, you're too far to the left for us by far. But then the people that actually desperately need the healthcare reforms and the wage increases and the climate crisis proposals like the Green New Deal that Bernie and AOC are proposing, they look at her suspiciously. And they should look at her suspiciously. She shows consistently bad instincts. And when I say that, I mean when she come into the race, she gave an ancestry test for Native American ancestry. It came back with 0%. Then she comes out and says, Pete Buttigieg, he used to work for a consulting firm, McKinsey consulting firm. You used to be a lawyer for DuPont Chemical Company. She turns his experience as a consultant against him. Does she really think that people are not going to know that she was a bankruptcy lawyer for DuPont Chemical Company? She represented coal companies. And then she talks about he hosts a wine cave fundraiser. And they said, well, you did 2 years ago when you're running for the Senate. Consistently bad instincts. I'm Medicare for all. And then when a lot of people seem to not like that or seem to don't give her the boost of it out of Bernie, she sort of walked a little bit back from that proposal. The 10,000 plans that she releases on her website, people always point that out. And it's like, yeah, some of them are fantastic. There's one proposal on there about ending the private prisons. Privatized prisons are a scourge. And you have an incentive to lock up more people and not rehabilitate. Prisoners are customers. It's like a reverse Best Western. Like, hey, we really want you to stay here. With private prisons, it's like, we really don't want you to have a choice. Stay here forever. All these hotel chains are going out trying to woo people. Private prisons, it's the opposite. They're trying to make it to where you can never leave. And they're trying to make you as worse off as possible. So you'll be back soon. Be like, hey, come back soon. Not like you have a choice. So she does have some truly great proposals, but I think that the left-wing progressive base, they view her very skeptically. And let's be honest, they were never going to get behind anybody besides Bernie Sanders. There's the Centrists, which is Klobuchar. I think she's trying really hard to be Biden's vice president. She seems to think the winning tactic is to talk about Minnesota nonstop. So Klobuchar really represents Minnesota, and I mean won't shut up about it. I mean talks about it all the time. And it's been a little odd because Minnesota is the only state in America that never voted for Reagan. Only state in America that never voted for Reagan. They're not a purple state in the Electoral College. They've been probably the only non-coastal state that Democrats can safely rely on. So to have a senator from Minnesota come out and go, I know how to win red states. She never has. And then people who've actually won in red states like Steve Bullock, it's like, oh, who gives a shit? Buttigieg, same thing. It's not technically a statewide race, but being mayor in Indiana, one of the most homophobic states in America, I mean, it is something. It shows that he can at least pull together the black vote, which is the majority of what you need to become a Democratic mayor in South Bend. So he had to have gotten some of it in South Bend for him to have been mayor in the first place. So it shows that he can do it as long as you push somebody like Joe Biden out of the way. And black voters are like, between Buttigieg and Trump, I guess we'll go a Buttigieg when there's no other choice. You have the Socialists, and then you have the Social Justice Warriors, and then you have the Centrists. And they're all fighting amongst each other. At the debates, Klobuchar, she punches Buttigieg one time, then she'll go after Warren, then she'll go after Sanders. I mean, she's kind of desperate at this point. It's become very clear that she's a stalking horse for Biden. Whoever's behind Biden's campaign clearly doesn't have confidence that he looks good on the offensive or can trade barbs with somebody who's at the top of their game. So they're kind of having Klobuchar do it for for him. That's what it always looks like to me. But because all these different groups are fighting each other, it really opens up a lane for Biden. And I would want to be him right now out of anybody in the party, because he's the front runner in all the polls, and yet his opponents are not treating him like the front runner. You've got Warren and Sanders being out there. You said something to me 5 years ago in a meeting that, no, I didn't. When we were in a meeting, you ordered an egg roll sandwich and you try to take it back and call it Philly cheesesteak. I mean, they're getting into pettier and pettier feuds. I don't think it makes either one of them look good. I really don't. And it again shows Warren's bad instincts. First, she's trying as hard as she can to suck up to Sanders, and then when it's too late in the game and it's 2 weeks before Iowa, then she's all of a sudden coming out with all these things that people can look at that and say, well, she's trying to mobilize female support, drawing attention to the fact you're a woman. That typically does the opposite. That kind of turns women voters off. Hillary lost 54% of white female voters. It almost looks like it's too little too late to try to be like, oh, by the way, out of the top 4 candidates, I'm a woman, and I haven't brought it up that much until now, but I really need you to remember that fact when you go into the polls. And a lot of people that would be motivated by that may not even vote in the Iowa caucus. The way they describe it on TV, it sounds like a truly awful way to spend your day. Going and voting in that, you've got these different demographics and groups that are fighting each other, and yet there's Joe Biden, who, for multiple reasons, is not exciting to a lot of people. He's not young, he's not cool, he's not hip. When he goes out on the debate stage, the first few debates, Kamala Harris is able to attack him on integrated schooling. This is something that has been pretty much settled science in the Democratic Party for 4 decades. If you can find a candidate who was once on the wrong side of school busing, that's probably not going to be the most exciting and relevant candidate that you can run. And then in the next debate, Christian Gillibrand found that he had written a letter being skeptical of women working in the workplace, being like, when women are out working, they're not raising kids, this is going to be bad for children. When you can find a nominee with that kind of baggage from decades ago, I mean, the Iraq War vote, sure, you understand that. That's relatively recent. Bernie uses it over and over. But Bernie, what's your plan to do with North Korea? Well, the first thing I need people to understand is that I did not vote for the Iraq War. Okay, that's great. But coming forward, Vladimir Putin, what are you going to do with him? I'm going to remind him that I'm the only one who didn't vote for the Iraq War. Brings that up over and over again. But stuff like women in the workplace, school busing, I mean, this is some dinosaur shit. This is like, you got to drag this out of the tar pits. And yet you have a candidate in 2020 who is the front runner, almost certainly going to be the nominee, even as the Democratic Party is running on the most progressive platform in history. There's never been a political party in American history running as progressive as they have, not just on economics, which he doesn't really share their beliefs on, but civil rights issues, which he doesn't really share their beliefs on. He's not really that great for the centrists because a lot of them want very pragmatic, capable, competent leadership like Buttigieg, and they feel like Biden is past his peak. He's definitely not great for social justice warriors because, like I said, if you can hit somebody on school busing, that's not going to be the candidate who's through the front door on civil rights. He looks like a little bit more of a states' rights guy than somebody who wants to set racism priorities from the top down. And then the socialists can't stand him for a lot of different reasons. And yet at the same time, I feel like the divisions between Warren and Sanders are so bad that Sanders fans would honestly prefer Biden to Warren at this point. I know Warren fans would prefer Biden to Bernie. I know that's true. So what looked like it was going to be his undoing has actually been his saving grace. The fractures in the Warren and Bernie and Buttigieg and Kamala Harris and Booker, all these camps, those fractures are really helping him because he now looks like a palatable second choice to all these groups. So any one of these groups, the way the Iowa caucus works is you do a first round of voting, and then if you don't clear at least 15%, then you don't get any delegates, and all your voters need to find somebody else. He now looks like a strong second choice for Bernie fans because they're so mad at Warren for bringing up all this shit right before the Iowa. They think it's going to hurt him overall. They wish she'd drop out in the first place. They don't want to see her get any delegates in Iowa because they're hoping the worse she does, the faster she'll drop out of the race and the better a chance he has to be the nominee. So they don't want to help her at all in Iowa. That's the second choice that obviously they don't want to help Buttigieg. Maybe Biden is their second pick. For Buttigieg fans, I know Biden's their second pick because they care most about foreign policy and wonkiness, and they know Biden is going to be the only candidate besides Buttigieg who even seems to have a foreign policy plan. Elizabeth Warren's foreign policy plan is to leave the Middle East altogether. Bernie Sanders' foreign policy plan is to remind everybody that he voted against the Iraq War. Okay, but what are you going to do with Russia and China? Next question. Then you have Elizabeth Warren fans, and I know they would prefer prefer Biden to Sanders, who they now feel is all of his Bernie bros are attacking her. Either way, it looks like he's in the catbird seat, and yet at the same time, the media isn't excited about this. And you can understand why. Because when you look back at the last several presidential elections, the guy who seems like the sure thing keeps losing. And I brought this up in episode 52. People have said this since I've said this, but I brought this up like a year ago. And I pointed this out back in 2016 as well with Hillary, because a lot of people would look at the past few decades and they'd say like, oh man, Ronald Reagan, he's fucking crazy, bananas nuts. There's no way he'll be president. And then he becomes president. Bill Clinton, an Arkansas governor with all these sexual harassment charges, no way, he can't do it, becomes president. George W. Bush, the idiot son of a guy who was just president, we're not a monarchy, there's no way people will be dumb, he becomes president. Barack Obama, Barack Hussein Obama, a guy who's the product of an interracial couple, which people like even less than a straight black couple, a guy whose father is a Muslim, so that's Islamophobia, a guy whose father is an African, so that's xenophobia, so it's even worse than if he were like, hey, I'm John Smith from South Carolina, he's Barack Obama Hussein, at a time where we're Islamophobic as hell and just fought a war in Iraq against Saddam Hussein. No way he can possibly be president, forget it. Becomes America's first black president, and the first president with an African father, and the first president with a Muslim father, and the first president of an interracial couple, and he becomes the first president to endorse gay marriage. That adds homophobia on top of everything else, just to make conservatives really fucking lose their minds. But he becomes president. Then you get down to Donald Trump, and you say, no, this guy is a fucking clown, he's a joker, he's a carnival barker, people will not fall for this crap, he becomes president. So the jokes look like they keep winning. Meanwhile, the candidates who look like they can't lose, Bob Dole loses, John McCain loses, Al Gore loses, John Kerry loses, Hillary Clinton loses, Mitt Romney loses. All of these safe centrists, it's their turn, they've been around forever, they don't seem to be the most exciting nominees. Mitt Romney, same thing happened to him in 2012, where it was like, oh, Rick Santorum's got it this week, oh, Newt Gingrich has got it, oh, Michelle Bachmann's got it, Ron Paul's got it. They must have went through about 5 different people that were polling a strong second to him, or sometimes polling higher than him, before it was like, we've exhausted everybody else. And we were going to do Gingrich, but he won't shut up about phaser beams on the moon and launching attacks on craters and shit like that, so we can't. They showed Gingrich, he was playing with rubber duckies in the bathtub, being like, pew, 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 take that, Iran. I mean, he didn't even look like a president, and so they had to go with Romney because everybody else imploded by default. I can see people's argument that when you go to the next logical choice, the safe centrist candidate who's not that exciting and doesn't inspire the base, typically they lose. And that makes total sense to me. But this is obviously not a typical election. Trump is not Bill Clinton or Barack Obama or even George W. Bush. I mean, there's really no roadmap for a president like this. It's just possible to me that even though Biden isn't the nominee we want, he's the nominee we need. I could definitely see Joe Biden beating Donald Trump. I'm not 100% sure that a President Elizabeth Warren I can say that about. She consistently shows bad instincts. And if there's one thing sociopaths are very good at, it's survival. Trump, is he crazy? Is he full of shit? Is he nuts? Absolutely. But he's very good at surviving. He's very good at getting beyond whatever, as we're seeing in the Senate impeachment trial. People are saying like, well, who does it matter who the Democrats put up because Trump's not going to be the nominee? If you believe that, then I've got a Trump hotel in Moscow I would like to sell you some shares in. And I don't think Trump will resign. People like Scaramucci keep saying stuff like, oh, Trump's going to resign. I don't believe that either. Basically, I think those divisions are what has allowed for a frontrunner that nobody particularly loves or cares about. But even though he's not the nominee we want, maybe he's the nominee we need. When they showed that show, The Weekly, that I'm talking about, all the other candidates, they all got in the elevator. Elizabeth Warren, she had that school teacher face, like she's scowling at the buttons or whatever, and Klobuchar looked nervous, and Bernie, they rolled him out of a cab into the building, and all these different candidates. Biden was the only one. He came with a very light entourage. He might have come by himself. From the way that they cut it together, it looked like he either came by himself or with only one other person. And he comes in the building, goes in the elevator, and first thing he wants to do is take a selfie with the elevator operator. And the woman who's in the elevator, she's a black woman, and she says, I love you. I love you. He goes, I love you too. Let me take a picture with you. He takes a selfie with her. But out of all the candidates that they show, and maybe it's just the way they cut it together, although I doubt it, but none of the other 6 even notice the elevator operator. They don't notice her. They don't talk to her. They don't want their picture taken with her. Biden has that personal touch. And when people sit there mystified, being like, how could Elizabeth Warren lose? How could Pete Buttigieg lose? How could Bernie Sanders implode? How could none of the media favorite candidates? How could none of them get anywhere? anywhere, that's how. What he showed you in the elevator, that's why he's the underdog frontrunner. He's the frontrunner that nobody talks about, that people act like is going to lose any minute, that people have written off, that they think he's brain damaged or over the hill. He's the quiet frontrunner. Maybe that's the candidate we need right now. Okay, everybody, thanks for listening. Please remember to go on alabamaliberal.com. I got new articles on there almost every day. I've got a YouTube channel that I constantly put new videos on. So there's Alabama Liberal on YouTube, there's alabamaliberal.com, and the podcast, of course. I'll be back shortly with episode 55, which is going to be a good one. Keep listening, everybody.